What's up, everybody? I'm Michael Fielding with the Free Academy. I'm here with Jared and Tyler today, and we were going to try to talk about conversations and creativity and see where things might flow. We also just discovered a bunch of sound effects,
You just discovered.
so we might pepper those in.
You just discovered that, Michael. We've all known about this.
Yeah, so I think where we kind of wanted to go with this is maybe how we can have disagreements in a progressive manner, like a way of working through problems in order to actually get at solutions where both sides come out of the conversation ahead of where they entered. And I guess what I've been thinking about on the topic is maybe admitting ignorance of some subjects, and yeah, go ahead, Jared.
Oh yeah, you got an echo going on.
Okay.
Not
sure
on
how to
my
fix
end.
that.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe it's just me then.
Yeah, maybe it's just you. What are you, a pig man with glasses now? Everybody found the Google effect, so this.
He's a dog man.
There's the cat man.
I'm a dog with clearly a mustache and some sort of goatee thing.
You're floating over a lake.
I'm floating over a lake with my
It
other
is
dog.
do or die.
I'm riding the Loch Ness monster here in this red hoodie across this beautiful lake.
Yeah. So like this is all making me think of how conversations work in a different way than what Michael just explained. It seemed like we were you were throwing things out there, trying to set up some sort of like atmosphere in which I don't know, like the conversation moved towards some sort of end that we had in mind, but then we started fucking around with all of this stuff, not really saying much as far as like the usual understanding of a conversation is concerned. But then it got me talking about whatever I'm saying right now. So at what point do the disagreements start coming in? Maybe once it becomes hyper-organized?
Yeah, maybe that is a great point, and maybe has something to do with formality versus informality. And yeah, maybe we could take that into creativity too, and maybe how formal kind of rigorous structures or even just expectations of how something might go can trap us like prematurely in a certain direction, and then we can't explore the whole field of possibilities, and therefore we can't be creative, and therefore we can't have fun conversations.
Yeah, right. And I think that so like there were a lot of Taoist inspired artists who would do stuff like maybe get really drunk on rice wine, and then they would dip their long hair into ink, and then they would just sort of like rub their head across a canvas, and then they'd back up, and then they would sort of see what the landscape was, right? Just sort of what kind of appeared there. They would, what's the word? Pareidolia. Right? They would have this moment of pareidolia where they would see certain images in this random sort of whirling of hair, of like inked hair splatters, and then they would fill in these details, right? So it seems like what we were just saying is something like once a conversation becomes highly organized and sort of like laden with preconceived notions, it starts to tense up, right? In the same way that the more I start to think about what I'm saying, the more I can't really say anything, right? Because I'm trying too hard to do something. So it seems like maybe the antithesis to creativity is hyper-organization.
Interesting. I might push back on just the use of the word because organization, even hyper-organization, like extremely nuanced things can emerge through like an evolutionary process that didn't really have like intelligent design, or wasn't preconceived in a certain direction. I'm thinking of the human eye, for instance, which is hyper organized. It's very, very complex and intricate, and if the layers were even a little bit messed up, they wouldn't work anymore. But that also wasn't pushed down a certain road at the beginning. It was evolutionary in the sense that a lot of different ideas were tried out, and the ones that work stuck around, and the ones that didn't went away.
Yeah, dude, and that's actually a good point. And so maybe I would want to say something so that you didn't get the wrong impression about what I was trying to suggest. Yeah, so I would definitely agree with you that and this is actually, if we're talking about it in terms of right, I had mentioned Taoist inspired artists. So if you're looking at sort of a philosophy like that, let's say whatever something like the Tao Te Ching teaches, or sort of things that people have gathered from that, it seems like things are already naturally becoming ordered, right? But the hyper organization that I was referring to would be a way of just trying too hard to do something. So as opposed to letting yourself realize that this order and this complex complex organization is already emerging, or I was just having a conversation with Matt today about the word emergence, but anyways, I'll just use it loosely, right? That things are ordered naturally in the way that you were suggesting about the eye, right? And so what I meant by hyper-organization would be the tendency to try too hard, in the same way that if you think about what you're trying to say too hard, you can't speak, right? You just have to start speaking. And I think that what is very telling of that is how, maybe if you think back a couple seconds ago, how I was kind of stumbling along, it was because I was thinking too hard about what my point was. But then now, once I just start letting that stuff come more naturally, it seems to make more sense to me, and I have less of a stammer, I have less of a pause, and
yeah,
so, yeah,
totally.
So
I have
was
that.
trying.
Sorry, that sparks a new thought in my brain, and it has to do with planning. Maybe since we're talking about improvisation and how that can help us be more creative and have better conversations, I think in another sense we have to tie in planning if we're going to have conversations at all. Well, that's not true. You can totally just bump into people. But this sort of conversation we're having right now is planned in a sense. So,
I guess,
but not the particular things that we're saying.
Definitely. So I guess, how do you pursue longer term objectives while still going with the flow? Do you understand the question? Like, if we're trying to be living in the moment, and there's reasons we found that that's either more fun or more enjoyable or provides more creativity, then how do we do things way in the future that require lots of work?
It's
you probably
almost
keep them more general. You just have to have those sort of long-term objectives. Just keep them very general points of reference, right? Because I think that the hyper-organization comes from you're trying to write down to the T every step that you're going to take to that objective. So you could imagine the steps get more plentiful the further out you project some sort of objection or objective. So if you're saying I want to be retired by 50, you could, well, maybe that's a bad example.
I was thinking of an example of really complex things, though. You just have to, say the James Webb Space Telescope, which they're going to launch in 2018, and they've already been working on it for 4 years, and it's one of these things where it has to work, you're spending so much time and energy, and it has to be planned out. You can't do that the day of the launch or anything. And it also reminds me of, say, sometimes symphonies, they're very planned. I know there's some improvised symphonies, or say figure skating routine. Like there are these things where if you want it to happen, it has to be like very precisely planned way in advance and like practiced and I don't know. That's not even a question, so it's an observation.
Yeah, maybe those future objectives, right? It makes me want to put into question how much they are in the future, because you gave the really great example of a telescope, right? Some sort of powerful telescope. Well, it has to be sort of sketched out to the T, right? And you have to follow these very sometimes specific and peculiar mathematical equations to sort of get certain things right. If let's say you're working with a big piece of glass that has to refract light in a certain way, or yada yada yada, and all these very little, down to the very small screws. Yeah, you gave that example, and those things take a long time sometimes. Can't just be done the day of. So then it got me thinking. So then, what about that objective? I mean, how far? I mean, like, and we can make sense of it in one way by saying that sort of the finished product is somewhere in the future, but
yeah, I think I see where you're going. Is that like still every day of the making of the telescope, you're still living in the moment on that day. You're just taking the next step. Is that maybe where you were going?
right. So then I guess what was happening is I was trying to oscillate back the other way, and so whereas before maybe we were suggesting that the spontaneity business is just a kind of like acting on a whim, but then I was maybe right there trying to like accommodate how you can still be hyper planned for something, but also be living each moment spontaneously, and so that's where we're at now.
Yeah. Okay, so to bring in another parallel to say the rocket would be maybe a dissertation or a thesis, which certainly takes a long time to plan and write and to perfect. I don't know if we want to use make it better, for sure. And so I guess each moment though you are living in the moment. You're trying to make this thing better. Maybe we could talk about like phase transitions because that seems like a hard. We've got living down in the moment, but how do you go from like one overarching goal to the other? Like that seems like a different idea entirely. Like how do you say give up on something? When do you decide to not pursue this goal you've
Finished.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. Maybe what you were saying was something slightly different. Yeah. When you give
Oh, I
up.
don't know.
But you know what I thought was interesting. So let's take the example of something like a musical production that you use computers and like microphones and studio spaces to produce, right? Or like let's say some musicians are making an album, or let's say something akin to that would be like writing a thesis or a dissertation that you said. Okay, so there's those kinds of examples on the one hand, which are these sort of constant discoveries, and like the writing process, sort of you only discover what really you had in mind all along by giving it a read once you've sort of finished the thing, right? So there's like this retroactive narrative telling. In the case of the satellite, it seems like you have all of this, you had the blueprint worked out, and then it's just a matter of mechanism. Like, it's just like you just follow the steps, and then you do it. So it seems like, that the process, so maybe the person, or like the people involved, in both cases can get really into their work, and each moment they're absorbed and they're really feeling it and they're just going along with it. But as far as the sort of object that you sort of end up with, it seems like those two are come into being in two very different ways, right? Like on the one hand, you have sort of like the work of art or the work of writing that sort of like emerges out of a constant discovery, right? Like as it's manifested, it's being discovered at the same time, whereas the satellite ends up being the result of something that was written down and says like, all right, this is what we're going to make, and so there's this kind of one-to-one correspondence between what it was thought to be beforehand and then what it actually ends up being and looking like.
You know, I would actually disagree maybe and say that those are a lot more similar than you may have just presented, because, for instance, with this James Webb Space Telescope, they didn't know they have used materials that on this space craft that were invented after they started working on it. So they had to start working before they knew exactly all the materials they were going to incorporate. And certainly along the way, the design changed, over and over again. So I think it was closer to exactly like making an essay where you write it once, you had a general overview, then you kind of hone it down, you see which parts work well with others, maybe some things need to be moved around. I actually think they're like isomorphic, actually, very close parallels in my mind.
Yeah, that's a good thing to point out. And so maybe what the suggestion is there is that that's kind of how all of reality is working at a fundamental level, right? It's sort of playing, well, okay, like maybe, whoa, that's a big step to take. Saying that, like maybe
reality.
Maybe most processes of creation or production, maybe that's just what they are all doing at a fundamental level. Yeah, they're all this kind of spontaneous or simultaneous manifestation and discovery, create or like invented and discovered sort of at the same time. And so then maybe it's just as subjects of knowledge, sort of maybe the difference is our ways of orienting ourselves toward various creative processes. That might become problematic or something, like to problematize it.
Okay, yeah, I see what you're saying. I totally dig the idea that all of the complexity and order that is apparent in the universe has come about through a process of evolution, essentially, like trial and error, and very, very few processes have been thought of ahead of time. Like even the airplane and stuff, that was trial and error. They were testing different models first. They didn't really know. They didn't write down ahead of time exactly how to build the plane and then go outside and build it. They were testing it. And same with birds' wings. Obviously they were designed over the course of millions of years through this process of natural selection. And I think, like you said, it's the way we orient ourselves to these ideas, or the way we perceive them, that often we give credit, we give this almost godlike credit to certain individuals, like Steve Jobs for the iPhone, or Elon Musk for whatever he's done, that as if they were the man. Yeah, and same with Edison, going back, I feel like every great inventor and discovery throughout history, we've given way too much credit to the individual who, did that phase transition like I talked about earlier. Like they were just the one that happened to be there on the day when we went from not flying to flying, but, it was this long process of evolution, and, the individual wasn't that particularly necessary even. It would have happened... over and over we see discoveries where people independently discovered, say, calculus, within 30 years of each other, and that, Newton gets the credit, but, at the end of the day, it's just ideas evolving, and I don't know if the individuals matter that much.
Yeah. No, and I think that that's where sort of like, insofar as there anything like a problem of the ego, right? Like I think it sort of hovers around that, right? When like we become obsessed with the one way of looking at it, which is like focus on like the individuals being like they're responsible, and so we praise Edison and sort of we give him all of this credit, which of course like we're still going to do that, right? But it's like once we become hyper obsessed with that image of ourselves and something, and it leads to, I don't know, needing all of the credits, and then you're just wanting to suck everything in.
Well, eventually it leads to suffering, right? That's the problem.
Yeah, that's what becomes problematic about it.
But
it's probably it ends up hurting other people, and by that line of reasoning, you just are other people also, and so you end up starting to hurt yourself, because it's all one big organism, right?
Totally. I had a lot of fun. So I guess just a creative aside. Earlier today, I was just imagining, Mother Earth as Gaia as this entity, and how if you could stretch all of time through the fourth dimension and see it as, I don't know if I can describe this, but I had this cool visual of how each of us is really connected all the way back to the first living organism, and just because we can't see fourth dimension of time stretched out as a spatial dimension doesn't mean it's not a valid interpretation. And from that sense, like, my body is connected to my body a second ago, and you could stretch it all the way back to like
when I was conceived, and then to when my parents' whole lives, went to where they were conceived, and then this whole backtrack. That was a fun ramble, but anyways, we're talking about creativity, so it applies.
And we're having a conversation.
Well, the clapping was for referencing when you were conceived.
Okay.
The audience. I polled the audience, and they approved via clapping.
Good.
Okay. The whole audience of zero live viewers.
No, both. Hey, there's no distinction between.
Yeah, Jared, you're the audience.
No, there's no distinction between students and teachers. There's no distinction between audience and participant.
Oh yeah.
I actually really dig that answer.
Actually, I want to take it on a tangent that something that Tyler said. You mentioned ego and like getting ego wrapped up in. I can't remember exactly in what way you brought up ego, but it's something I was thinking about a lot. Is
like if you become obsessed with it, it can be problematic.
Yeah, if you have ego or a lot, well, we all have. The thing is, I feel like this is such an interesting thing, getting ego wrapped up in ideas, because it's one of these traits that I think you can work on your whole life, and no one's ever existed where if zero is no ego attached to any idea, you can never get to zero. No one's ever been there.
Sure.
I feel like it's this skill of like learning to detach your ego from your ideas that everyone can work on their whole life, and they'll never be perfect at it. But it's so critical to, because like, what is intelligence? Is intelligence just being able to recall a lot of information, or is open-mindedness a part of intelligence? Because if that's the case, then to be intelligent would mean to learn to not have your ego so tied to any of your ideas or beliefs.
Yeah, dude. That's the classic distinction between being knowledgeable and being wise, right? Yeah, and I think that I would agree with you. Like I think you were saying, like you were asking, to be intelligent, does it just mean that you can recall a bunch of information, or does it mean that you have an open mind? And I think that, I would say that's what intelligence is. Maybe in ancient times they would say that's what it is to be wise, or that's what they understood by what it meant to be wise. And I think that that's one of our most valued virtues to have. Who knows why it is, but I think it's probably important to at least creativity, since that's what we're talking about here. So like a certain kind of intelligence is required to be creative, and it's and I think it's an openness right? So, like, if you're going to create new situations, new environments for ourselves that we think are going to make things better, then it requires that you have a certain kind of openness in your critical discourses with other people.
Totally. That's sparking some ideas in me about how our perceptions of ourselves and the continuity of self versus the idea of the discontinuity of self. So the idea of a continuous self is basically that I'm the same person as I was yesterday, as I was the day before, and it's all one entity, and I'm this thing that exists from from birth until death. Versus the idea of the discontinuous self is kind of the one I prefer, and I think it's because of these reasons. And it's the view that I'm a new person every instant of every day, and I'm constantly being born anew, and that frees me to both explore tons of possibilities that I might not be able to explore if I thought of myself as this person with properties rather than an emergent phenomenon that's like being created. It's not a thing that exists, it's constantly being created. And it frees myself, I think, from feeling guilt or like bad about, former actions. I can see it as a mistake a previous version of myself made, and I can learn from them, but I'm not that person anymore. I've grown since then, and it frees me to I think, interact with people on a more improvised level and be more real, so to speak, which is kind of funny, like, to think of being real as being created anew every instant, but I don't know, it kind of goes hand in hand in my brain.
Yeah. I think there's this weird, you hear it a lot with, I guess you just hear a lot in general about people. There's this weird thing that if you change as a person, it's this bad thing.
You've changed.
He's changed. And it's like, well, what hasn't changed? What in this life doesn't change? What is positive about the trying to fight the inevitable change that will occur for all of us and all mankind and all creation? And it's just this weird. It just seems like such a big waste of energy to just constantly try and fight change. But people do it with individuals a lot, and it seems to be generally negative when it's brought up. Well, sometimes it's positive. Sometimes people could have it in.
You lost weight.
Yeah, or some people could have what's considered a checkered past, which is subjective. So who knows what I even mean by that? But then they change, and it's like they make positive changes for themselves. But I hear it more often referenced in a negative light. So I think that's a weird thing.
Yeah. So I have a question. I wonder, do we think that there are any permanent things? Is there any sort of maybe a form to reality that stays the same? Is there anything that doesn't change?
That's a super interesting question, and where my mind went instantly was to maybe the fundamental particles, which are these entities hypothesized by scientists that say like the electron or certain quarks that are theorized to not break down any further. So these are kind of the building blocks of everything we see around us. So there are 3 quarks in every proton and every neutron, and then those form the nucleus of an atom, and there's an electron that orbits, or multiple electrons, and the electron is hypothesized not to be reducible to any other form, so in essence it can't break down. So in a way the idea is that they're permanent, and so all electrons that will ever exist do exist, and I'm not sure actually. There is different types of radiation that are particles breaking down into each other, but I don't think the electron does. But anyways, so there is this idea that, maybe there are things that are permanent. They change in their arrangements, but not these fundamental blocks, is the idea.
Yeah, see, that's interesting to hear you talk about it like that, because my natural inclination is to not as I would just it's that seems to me to be coming at it from a different way that I would normally want to, because I had mentioned something like form, and you automatically went to theoretical entities that are presumed to be permanent and stuff like that. But that just seems to, but those theoretical entities seem to play the same role in scientific theories that something like Newton's laws of physics played, and so if it's possible for them to ever be sort of changed in any way, right? If those notions ever change slightly, then it just goes to show that maybe that substance that we had in mind wasn't unchanging like we thought that it was. And so I had mentioned something like form, so I wonder how that's any different than what you were just saying, because it seems to me like certain forms of thought, maybe the only thing that wouldn't change would be that there has to be a void for there to be something, right? Like, that would probably be how I would want to answer that question.
That's
so, like,
okay.
how it's slightly
that.
different than you just pointing to a bunch of things and saying these things are the impermanent things. But I'd want to say it's more something
Totally.
like yeah.
So that made me think maybe another permanent thing is maybe the phrase "I exist," even, because, or like the recognition of an I, because, you know, for anything to exist. See, this is getting into the subjective, objective, you know, whether anything exists outside of, you know, perception kind of idea. But real quick on the particles, I also agree that I'm not convinced, you know, these are the last, you know, the electron is unbreakable or whatever. But I'm also not open to the idea that there is fundamentally unbreakable things, which is an interesting concept, but I don't know. I'm not ready to rule it out. I'm not convinced we figured them out yet, or that there are any, but I think it is one possibility that there are kind of fundamental building blocks. You know, like, say if we were being run in in the Matrix or in some kind of simulation, maybe eventually you could figure out the actual rules that are simulating that thing. I don't know. It's just a possibility in my mind.
Yeah, that's like us. That's like us coming to discover laws of physics or something like that, which we then in turn
Definitely.
understand
Maybe
as
they are
like going
permanent.
into how sort of consciousness like emerged out of. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, totally. But yeah, maybe the laws of physics are permanent. And another question is, though, when would we be willing to make that claim? Because, you know, induction is not foolproof. Just because the sun rose yesterday doesn't mean it's going to rise tomorrow. And just because we've always seen gravity act a certain way doesn't mean it will continue that way tomorrow. So at the end of the day, it is always kind of a human invention of permanence, I think. Or you'll never know. It's a hypothesis. I don't know. If that makes sense.
You say that all the way, yeah, because you can say that all, and it could ring true all the way until the day it doesn't. I think you just, all of a sudden, you thought this thing that's been true for so long that we called permanent was, you know, it just wasn't. It was just on a timeline that was beyond our comprehension.
Yeah, like, okay, so, like, maybe I want to step back and make a comment on our conversation so far. So, like, one of my philosophical heroes is the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, and he sort of marked what we call like the critical turn in philosophy, and it's where his whole idea was trying to understand the limits of human reason, and you know, eventually we get to a certain boundary point where we can't think outside of it, and it's like we have to posit some sort of super sensible noumenal realm, right?
What's noumenal mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So like for him, it's a technical term. He made a distinction between the phenomena or like between the phenomenon and noumenon. So phenomenon would be
Labels.
yeah. So like the phenomenal realm would be the realm of knowledge, right? All things that could be perceived and known within the limits of human reason, and then noumena, or like the noumenal realm, was a necessary counterpart to the phenomenal realm that needed to be posited by human reason. But it only had an idea of it, so like it's just supposed to refer you to the conceptual counterpart to a world of things, right? I had said something to the effect like there is necessarily a void if there's going to be things, right? Like a void in which there can be things or something like that. And so you can think of the phenomenon noumenon distinction like that. But anyways, like I don't know how important like the details of his distinction are, but maybe I want to back away from that term. But anyways, so if I'm making a comment on our conversation right now, Kant makes this distinction, or he marks the turn of critical philosophy, and that's to say he wants to understand the limits of human reason. And once we start to overstep what our thinking capacities allow for us to think, then we're stepping into the noumenal realm, and we don't have any sort of room to talk about it. Okay, so what's happening to us right now in our conversation, we've dug deeper and deeper and deeper, and it's starting to get really wonky, and we can't really contain it. And I think it's because we're getting to the perimeters of it all, which is just a kind of which is just things that we start trying to think about that we have no room trying to think about. And so I think that a good practice is to, once you realize that you've hit that boundary, to sort of shrink yourself back into the concrete, and then we'll probably work our way back out, and then you just keep expanding and then collapsing like that. Dog face. I'm just gonna look at your dog face for a second.
Yeah, let's turn it to super concrete.
Is the
is it apple tree only an apple tree once it has apples on it?
I think it's that even from seed stage.
Yeah. Also, well then sperm is a baby.
See, okay, so yeah, maybe that wasn't even concrete enough. Like, Michael, what's your favorite kind of food?
It's different every day. I don't know. Right now, I could probably go for some Vietnamese food. I had some down the street yesterday. It was really good. So I don't think I have a favorite food overall. That kind of ties back to the whole discontinuity of self thing, where I don't feel like I'm a thing with attributes like a favorite food. I think it's a emergent thing that I'll decide every moment of every day. And really, more than any food or drink, I like variety. So I couldn't begin to tell you my favorite because it would change as soon as I said it.
You know, it's interesting. I think how many traits do you think we assign ourselves, and then we commit energy to try and reinforce that they're true? Like, I could say my favorite color is purple, but then I put energy into kind of reinforcing the idea that purple actually is my favorite color. Like, I want to live up to the fact that I've designated it my favorite. And it's really strange behavior.
Yeah, I think about the same with hobbies too, like golf, for instance. You know, I know people try really hard to be good at golf. They buy a lot of expensive clubs, they buy the balls, they buy the shoes and the clothes to be a golfer. And then, you know, they have to play golf because now they have all these things, so you got to play lots of golf to make it valuable. I don't know. But I think the same is for lots of hobbies, you know, and that's actually something, you know, I feel like I get scared of getting too far down any one route because I don't like the idea of kind of getting trapped in any certain path. I love keeping my options open, and that lets me improvise, which, yeah, it can be scary sometimes, but I think, I don't know, after the fact, I'm always super glad I did it. In the moment, sometimes I'm like, yeah, nervous or not always feeling good, but, I don't know. It's been a fun life, so, figure I'll keep doing it this way.
I think the stresses that come from improvising to me are less severe than the restriction that comes with not doing things impromptu. Like the being constricted, even if it's only mentally, it's imposed by myself. Feeling constricted to a specific like idea, course of path, or plan comes with far more emotional stress than the little stresses that I put myself in by improvising.
Hmm.
Yeah,
So-
for sure.
So
What do you-
I
Yeah, go ahead.
I think
Well, generally, it's a generalization because sometimes like I do plan things a little bit, or there's always this balance of like a vague idea that gets discussed, and then I never really know what the end result's going to be till it's now and I'm doing it. But there's there's a little bit of planning when I say impromptu for them. Generally, so it's always like these words are on a scale, so I don't. They're like on the extremes, and everything's always some sort of operation in the middle. But so anyway, I was just generalizing there. I guess is what I was trying to say.
that's what. Well, yeah, that's what we were talking about earlier, saying like like improvisation comes in part through having rules of thumb, right? Like explicit to your reflection, at least at some point. Like if you look at a jazz guitarist, right? They have to. There's a certain level, or like up front, there's a certain learning curve, right? You have to sort of learn your scales in some way, or maybe figure them out by yourself through trial and error and through your ear. But whatever the case may be, it seems like there's a certain learning curve up front, and then at some point you just kind of channel the natural flow of things through your having realized that capacity. And so this had me thinking about what freedom is, and I think that that's probably one of my favorite accounts of freedom, because I think it gets closer to the real phenomenon of being free. Is that our freedom consists in realizing what has just kind of been accidentally bestowed upon you, right? And so it's not so much, right? If you look at a great athlete, sometimes people can become great athletes through like a lot of practice and hard work, but in most cases, even their practice and hard work is facilitated by these happy accidents that have been bestowed upon them, whether we understand it in terms of genetics and biology or culture or what have you. So it seems like, when they're a really good athlete, right, it's at a very fundamental level something that they're not responsible for, right? And so it seems like if we're gonna make sense of freedom in some way that's true to that insight, then it has to consist in understanding freedom as just realizing and being self-aware of your happy accidents, and just saying, all right, well, fuck it, I guess this is who I am, and then you just live that out in a quasi-reflective way or something. I don't know.
Totally.
I really dig that idea, and it makes me think about language and maybe what role language has in freedom, and how it's kind of one of those happy accidents of being taught how to do something by, say, being introduced to language at an early age, or learning to read early, and then you learn these different tools that you can incorporate into your own cognitive abilities. And just the more words you learn, the more you can think, and can get this feedback cycle going. And just like maybe a young athlete being pushed to perform on a team, and it starts this feedback loop where he's successful, he or she, and then they try harder, they practice more, they get better, they feel good about that, they practice more, this feedback loop gets started. And I think the same thing is true of language, and I do think, the ability to formulate ideas with these labels, I think that's the nominal realm, like Kant was saying. Is that what am I using that right?
Yeah, I mean, like maybe that's why I kind of wanted to shy away from it, because, but maybe I don't know, like I kind of what you just said there right at the end kind of escaped me, but from what I remember, it didn't. Maybe that's exactly right.
Anyways,
yeah, I think the freedom to think is crucial for the freedom to behave in different patterns, and having more. Not just words themselves, but relationships between words, more ideas, allows us more freedom. So yeah, it's interesting how that plays a role too. Just like in that early feedback loop process, it's really interesting to me how just once you get started, it can have this snowballing effect. And now that like I know how to learn, I can help myself learn more and more faster, and it's a fun process once you figure it out, I guess.
So I think that's interesting that you brought that up in reference to what I was saying about freedom, because actually there's a philosopher that I read sometimes, or that like in the last couple of years I got into reading. His name's Robert Brandom, and he had wrote this paper called Freedom and Constraint by Norms, and he makes this distinction between positive and negative forms of freedom. And like I will get to the language thing because he ends up bringing language up as one example, but I'll just maybe explicate the distinction there between positive and negative forms of freedom. So a negative freedom is freedom from something. So, sorry?
Hey, are you guys hearing Tyler? Or Mike, can you hear Tyler? I can't.
Yeah, I can hear him.
Oh, man. I just missed your whole point.
Well, he's just getting to it on the difference between positive and negative freedoms.
Okay, I thought I missed the definition of negative freedom. I was quite disappointed.
No, so negative freedom is a freedom from some constraint. So let's say that you want to be free, like you're a teenager, and your parents say you need to be back at 12:30, mister. And I'm like, why do you always gotta be telling me what to do, right? You want to be free from that constraint, right? You want to be free from that constraint, or maybe you have to pay taxes, and we want to be free from having to pay taxes to the state, right? We want to be free from something. So there's a sense of negative freedom, and maybe I'll get back to certain critiques that people have of negative freedom and certain maybe political theories that people think go overboard, or like metaphysical theories that go overboard with the negative freedom. But anyways, positive freedom is a freedom to do something. So this comes through being constrained by norms. A classic example is like chess or some sort of game that functions off of rules. You're not free to move a chess piece or a pawn 2 squares ahead on your first go unless you've submitted to the rules of chess. So we have negative freedom on the one hand, which is freedom from some constraint, and positive freedom on the other hand, which is a sort of a freedom that comes through being constrained in a certain way. And so a really good example of this is language, as you had brought up, Mike. And it seems like you can't be free to utter a novel sentence or a sort of novel poem or something, or whatever it is, something with language. You can't be free to like utter something novel unless you've already submitted to speaking a certain language, right? That have with words that have various meanings given certain context clusters, or certain syntactical and grammatical structures that help situate that meaning, and so on and so forth, with all the all the properties of language. And so I think that oftentimes, if we're going to talk about anarchy, a lot of people maybe would want to critique the idea of anarchy because they think that it sort of advocates a kind of radical freedom, this sort of a radical negative freedom, and they want to be free from all of these things, and they think maybe it neglects the fact that a lot of our freedoms are positive, which is to say a lot of our freedoms come through being constrained by certain norms. So I wonder what thoughts you might have on the idea that a part of us, as Jared had hinted at earlier, with saying like we're never going to hit absolute zero with respect to our egos, seems like that's a certain constraint on us. Or you can never get rid of the fact that you were born in the 21st century or something like that. I wonder what thoughts you have on this idea between negative versus positive freedom and how it may apply to certain political views that you may have.
Yeah, totally. And I really like making the distinction too. So, man, I don't know where to start with that. I guess where my mind goes first is to maybe the difference between seeing groups of people as a society versus an individual, and maybe how that kind of gets tied into the idea of positive and negative freedoms. So like you're saying with language and other cultural kind of norms, we feel some negative freedoms being taken away from us, I think, just by being a member of a certain society. So, for instance, we might not yell certain words in certain places because we understand that other people might react with fear or disgust or hate or something, or might suffer as a result. Versus from the individual perspective, we often want to have positive freedoms. I want to be able to do whatever I want without being constrained. So yeah, there's totally this kind of dichotomy between the two. And I guess as it applies to my political philosophy, I don't know, I guess we have to strike a balance, but what kind of where I think it lines up, where the social and the individual phenomenon perspective line up, is I think on the very root of my disagreement with government, and that's the taxation part. I think that's where not only is it aggressing me as an individual and taking my individual liberties away, but it's also disrupting the emergence of organization at the social level. And because we're undercutting the market, the price effect and the flow of money by allowing fear to drive money to certain groups and doing certain activities, the money's not flowing to the places it might with a free market, without this monopoly of violence. So that's where they line up in my mind, both the individual perspective of just as an individual I don't want to be aggressed, but also the social thing that I think more people will be happier in a society where there isn't taxation. And I know I harp on taxes all day, but without taxes they can't have the rest of it. So that's why if you can do it voluntarily, awesome. Like whatever you want to build voluntarily, it's cool. But once you cross the line into taxation, then you're disrupting the flow of the free market, and that's going. I have other people have hypothesized, and my understanding of economics drives me to think that less people's desires will be met if we don't let the free market just run how it will. So yeah, I guess that's the best I can do.
Yeah, no. That's some good thoughts there.
I think it's interesting too, because you do hear in regards to a lot of people's view of government is that true freedom is you need a government in order to have true freedom. It's like because man, I can't explain it, but I get the conversation a lot where you know, that you need that sort of, you need some semblance of structure for there actually to be freedom, which to some extent might be the case, but uh, I guess I don't follow the logic all the way to what they're bringing it up to mean, but I do see that there's some truth to that. Also, I mean, it's all the voluntary thing, you know, like with you said with chess, that's still freedom because you're entering into it like you're choosing to abide by those rules. But some people would say, if you translate that to government, that if you stay in a country, you're choosing to abide by the rules. So I guess that's one of my favorite words to think about right now is voluntary. Like, if you really, if you want to expand the definition of voluntary, ultimately everything's voluntary. So it's like, where do you draw that distinction and how you utilize that word?
Yeah, yeah. And I think that this goes back to what Mike was saying about balance, and it almost seems cliche because we're always like, well, you know, everything in moderation, right, sweetie? It seems like, yeah, I mean, it's probably going to boil down to some sort of balancing act between, right, because maybe we're all willing to admit that part of our freedom comes through being constrained by norms, but maybe sort of like the caveat there is, or sort of the catch there is that it comes through sort of voluntary or like informed consent or something like that. Whereas maybe something like taxation like oversteps that because it sort of has these implications of force in it, and maybe people didn't voluntarily sign up for it, and maybe certain people that don't wish to live under that system kind of have to, or you know, who knows. So maybe we're willing to admit that part of our freedom comes through being constrained, and so so at that point it just becomes a matter of, yeah, like getting certain of those things out of here because they're just bullshit, you know, like, hey, look, we're willing to admit that we're always going to be constrained, but Jesus Christ, like certain ways that you're constraining me just don't fit our philosophy of how we think things should be, or something like that, like whatever your moral or political philosophy is.
Yeah, totally.
Oh, yeah. And then, Mike, you had said something about you think that less people's desires will be fulfilled if we don't get out of the way of the free market with the taxation stuff. And I wanted to ask you, how important is it that more people are fulfilling their desires? And what do you understand by desire? And can just having all of our desires met, could that ever be considered a bad thing?
Man, okay. That it's got a great questions. I'm not sure if we can even talk about my desires in terms of your desires, or if using the same word is making sense even. So on one level, I totally think that we might be talking about a million different things when we're talking about a million different people's desires. But it brings up this whole question, I guess, of how do you judge how well a society is functioning? Or we could translate it to other things, like how well is any population doing? How do I know if, you know, some pack of hyenas is doing okay, or like an ant colony? Like, can I look at it and figure out, and how do I compare one to another? Like, can I see one is healthy and one is sick? And I think on some level we can, because we can look at different humans and tell, you know, some are sick. They don't seem healthy, but it's so hard to get into very strict distinctions between what is health and what is sickness. So on that level, like, how do we compare different types of economies? How can we compare, say, the United States during the last 50 years versus, say, Russia during the last 50 years, and how have different events that have happened along the way impacted them? And it's so hard to compare and say, like, is one better than the other, or like which one might we prefer to live in. Although on the high level, a lot of people could say they would rather have been in the United States during certain parts of the last 50 years rather than Russia. But, you know, other people might have said the opposite. So how do you compare, like, whether an economy is doing well or not? But on the other hand, we do have these words like depressions and recessions, and, like, there is this general feeling that you can ask people, like, do you think the economy is doing well? And you can get different answers and kind of get a sense of, you know, people's feelings. And, you know, that made my mind go to a pool of water and, like, what's its temperature, you know? And each individual water molecule might be traveling different speed, you know, and that's ultimately what you're measuring with temperature, is kind of an average kinetic energy of that pool. But each water molecule has a different individual perspective, you know, on how fast am I traveling. And you stick the thermometer in there and you get an overall reading. But that's so hard for groups of people. You know, we can take polls, and you can do elections, you know, but what does an election mean? What is a poll? How much can you read into that? And I don't know. So it is hard to compare economies, but there are some principles that we've seemed to have discovered, you know, about supply and demand and behavioral economics. We can run experiments and see how people operate in laboratories and deduce things from different historical events. You know, all of that is rife with speculation, and it's hard to know how trustworthy it is. But I have at least been... Okay, desires. I mean, that's demand in my mind. You know, how much are people willing to pay, or how much effort are people willing to exert to make it happen, I guess? I don't know. I'm just picturing a demand supply curve.
Like, I fucking want to have orgasms because they feel great.
So you're probably
like what point is having all the orgasms I want? Like, does that ever become problematic? And so I think what I was trying to ask is, in principle, does it make sense to say that the more that each person's desires are fulfilled, right? Does that actually mean that that sort of things are going to be better? Because you had suggested that maybe, hey, like if we do X, Y, and Z, then more people's desires will be fulfilled, and I take it.
I totally would. If I could go back, I would have changed that to maybe a more healthy economy. Maybe that's a better way of saying it, to kind of just, you know, admit to this kind of rough feel of, because how do you know if something's healthy? So yeah, I don't think fulfilling every person's desires is maybe the best thing. And then we have to talk about short-term versus long-term desires, and how each of us are really multiple different people living at different times, kind of back to the discontinuity of self idea, and what I want right now might be different than what I want 10 minutes from now. And so, okay, I totally wish I could go back and say something like a free market would encourage a more healthy economy. But man, see, that starts to sound just so loose and like it doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, we're never going to get to the bottom of it. You know, we just have to, because, you know, once we get off this thing here, we're just going to go back to living.
Yeah, cool. Because the point is what's better, and the only person who can tell you what's better than something else is the person who has that opinion. Like, the individual determines what's better. Because to say that there is an objective better or not better, isn't that implying that there's a supposed to be? You know, like, to say that this is better than that implies that there's some objective state that is supposed to exist.
So then, like, this is always the problem with relativistic views, and I think that what
I was gonna say is that like, that's what I take it to mean when you say something's better or not, like, as a generality, then you're implying that there's an objective way that something's supposed to be. Is that a decent inference? Are you guys like? Or is that a false connection.
Yeah, so like of course all of that rests on a discussion of what it is for something to be truly objective, but like I would want to say before that I don't think that it doesn't make a lot of sense to talk about a collective or like a general good, only because we're at the base of it willing to admit that we're the same kinds of beings, right? Like we're all human beings. So it seems that we're unified in some sense, so that it at least doesn't seem crazy to talk about things, values that are general and universal amongst us all.
But
then,
yeah. Or no, well, I think I lost my thought anyway.
So like just because we can't really produce necessary and sufficient conditions for how we would know what is the universal good or something like that, like I don't think that it precludes that there is some sort of universal good that we can talk about. Insofar as we're willing to admit that we're all the same kinds of beings, human beings or whatever.
Yeah. I think.
See, that's sorry. Okay, so that's kind of why I tried to bring in that whole health idea and maybe looking at human societies as if they were ant colonies or beehives or something like that, where you can talk both about the health of an individual bee and an individual ant, and you can talk about the health of a colony. And so in that sense, there is a way of, you can tell when a beehive is sick. Like there are signs that I wouldn't know them personally, but bee people would know how to see, a disease spreading through a beehive, or same with an ant colony.
They want to be healthy, though. Maybe they would rather do heroin and be in the condition they're in than what we define as health. So maybe those bees actually are perfectly healthy.
There are those particular cases, yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point. And man, I don't know how you could even start to talk about, addicts and both, within humans and say, or diseases within other organisms, and whether people might actually prefer to be diseased from one's perspective, but from the other perspective it'd be a feature. I don't know, man. See, that's, I have no way past that shit, so.
Like my last semester, as I was writing my thesis, I led a reading group on Kant's Third Critique, which is actually a work on aesthetics, and so he talks about the power of judgment, and he uses as his example the judgment of taste or the judgment of beauty, and he makes a really, of course it's a crazy, complicated, highly architectonic, which is to say only makes sense in the context of the rest of his philosophy, but he makes this argument for how something like beauty is necessarily universal. So I just wanted to make a plug or like a reference to a document that I have on my academia.edu page, which is a sort of section by section notes that I took when I read it. And so you can refer to something like that to look at his arguments for how something like the value of beauty can be thought to be necessarily universal, or at least universally shared between all subjects of knowledge.
Dude, I think we should end on that, because this is getting long, and that was a really good example of kind of free education and, plugging other ideas and pointing people in the right direction, and also linking to your own stuff. Speaking of that, if you want to see other stuff that we've made, you should go to freeacad.com, where we kind of just post whatever is interesting to all of us, and you're totally welcome to register for free and post alongside and comment and help with the evolution of knowledge and this little community that we've kind of begun. So until next time, thanks for tuning in. You should subscribe to this channel to see future episodes, and thanks Tyler and Jared. Peace out, everybody. See ya.